Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. We're just going to give it a couple minutes, let people trickle in if they had a meeting, back up against this one. So we'll start here in a couple minutes. I'm going to put you guys back on hold for a second. All right, looks like a few more folks have jumped in, so let's get started. Martha, I started the recording. Thanks everybody for jumping into my webinar on Microsoft Fabric. Today is July 13th, 2023, and Fabric is currently in public preview. But there's a lot of features to try out and learn about, even in this early stage. So let's get into it. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Matt Szafir, and I have over a decade working in the data engineering field, with almost all of it being on the Microsoft platform. For the past 3+ years or so, I've been working in the field of consulting. And as Atmosera's data and AI practice lead, I enjoy helping customers architect, implement, and understand how to be successful on the Microsoft suite of data analytics services. As I mentioned, I work for Atmosera, so I want to tell you a little bit about our company. We're based out of Portland, Oregon, and at Atmosera, our vision is to transform the world through the power of the Microsoft cloud. Our company was established over 25 years ago, and we're a leader in the Azure space. At Atmosera, we have a three-pronged approach to success. Each prong kind of supports and contributes to the others. One is professional services, which I'm a part of. We also have our training arm and our managed services arm. In pro services, our specialties are in app modernization, data and AI, security, DevOps, and overall Azure architecture. We are a Microsoft award-winning global partner. We're an Azure expert MSP. We hold 5 advanced specializations for Microsoft and 4 Microsoft partner designations. So before we get into it, just want to mention who this webinar is targeted at. The audience generally is just anybody that's on a data team. So, all the way kind of from an intern just out of college, getting started in data, all the way up to a chief data officer, I think will benefit from this webinar. We're not going to get too technical. Thanks to Fabric, we don't have to. It's a pretty easy service to get results out of. So first, we're going to start with the general overview and benefits of Fabric. It's a big topic, so we're not going to be able to cover all of it in the hour today. We'll get into what Microsoft has deemed experiences within the service. We're going to talk about how Fabric jives with Power BI. And we're going to discuss capacities, which is kind of how you purchase Fabric. And then we're going to get into OneLake. And beyond the slide deck, we're going to get into a hands-on demo. And at the end, we'll come back for questions, kind of discuss the current limitations of, in this preview phase and what the future holds for Fabric. Hopefully, we can leave some time at the end for questions. So feel free to chat, I think, the questions using the GoToWebinar tool. Today, we're not going to be able to cover everything, like I said. We're not going to get into security in too much detail. We're not going to get into governance or the Purview integration with Fabric. We're not going to do too much with like real-time streaming. We're not going to get deep into the AI and ML or Copilot aspects of Fabric. We're not going to get deep into pricing or DevOps or like the Git integration. Well, maybe that'll be in a future webinar. All right, so there's a lot of analytics tools in the market today. In this section, I'm going to go over kind of the highlights that I've seen in this service that, in my opinion, make it the best analytics solution for both novice and experienced data teams. The first thing I'd like to highlight is that Fabric is a unified SaaS environment. And with Fabric, Microsoft has what they're deeming these experiences, and they're all included in this SaaS product. You can see in the image in the slide deck here that there's a number of products that were previously under the Synapse umbrella have been brought into Fabric. These services have been retooled, improved, and combined with Power BI and other tools in this platform. The additional tools are just, part of the differences between Fabric and Synapse. If you're experienced with Synapse in the past, you know that it requires, there's some level of expertise required to be successful in Synapse. Yeah, you have to at least understand, well, to provision it, you have to understand the Azure portal. You have to set it up. You have to know a little bit about networking, RBAC permissioning. There's a proprietary engine within Synapse, so that can make it difficult to understand what's happening behind the scenes. And these intricacies, was valuable to a consultant like myself who, had to be, became an expert in all of these intricacies, but ultimately not that beneficial to the end user to quickly get results. So Microsoft identified that, and with Fabric has made everything a lot simpler to approach and be productive. And bringing all of these tools into this unified environment, what I will kind of call the one paradigm, is a huge advantage. With Fabric, we have one open storage format, one security model, one kind of CI/CD pipeline, OneLake. I mentioned OneLake, and you can see that on the bottom layer here. And what that means ultimately is that Microsoft heard the demand from the industry for one source of truth, one data lake, and now with Fabric, they've delivered on that. And we'll get into the intricacies of OneLake in some subsequent slides. Before we get into OneLake, let's talk about the individual experiences. So there's presently a set of 7 experiences within Fabric, and an experience is defined as a collection of capabilities targeted to a specific functionality. So when you're interacting with Fabric, whether you're a data engineer, a data scientist, a data analyst, or just a data enthusiast within your company, there's a Fabric experience tailored to you. And doesn't mean that you're locked out of any tools within these experiences. It's just kind of how the tools are presented to you. Some of the tools are presented in multiple experiences. The first one here shown is Data Factory. This is familiar to you if you're familiar with Azure Data Factory or Synapse pipelines. This is kind of where you build your pipelines, you cleanse your data, you transform your data, you import your data. That's where that magic happens. So if you're familiar with pipelines from ADF, this will be very similar. If you're familiar with data flows from Power Query, those will also be very familiar to you here. The data flows from ADF and Synapse pipelines don't exist in Fabric. They've been replaced by the data flows from Power Query. So that can kind of be a little bit confusing. But once you get into data flows from Power Query, which I previously didn't have as much experience with, it's very easy to transfer your skills from the ADF version of data flows over. The next experience is Synapse Data Engineering. This is where you build out your lakehouse. So this is for engineers that are most familiar with the Spark engine and the notebook development environment. So you interact with your data here using Spark notebooks. You can use, PySpark, Scala. You can code up your transformations and write data out, similar to the experience in a product like Databricks. The next experience is Synapse Data Science. This is where you build your ML experiments, you create your models, you perform ML ops here. There's also a tool within Synapse Data Science that I don't think has enough, has been talked about enough. It's called Data Wrangler. This is a notebook-based exploratory data analysis tool using Pandas data frames. So it's definitely beneficial for data scientists to get a handle on data sets that they're going to be using in their experiments and models. But I think it can also be useful for data engineers who are importing new data sets. I know it's always, it takes a while to become familiar with a data set and learn how to cleanse it and do data modeling. So wanted to recommend that. Check out that data wrangler tool within the data science experience. The next experience here is Synapse Data Warehouse. This is going to be where your data engineers that are most comfortable with SQL do most of their work. So this is the SQL endpoint for your structured data. You can use just your regular SQL queries. Your queries can be stored within the tool or shared amongst your team. You can create stored procedures. A full SQL-like experience is available, and we'll see that in the demo of the data warehouse here later. The next experience is Synapse Real-Time Analytics. This is where you get your KQL databases. That's Kusto query language. You can do your query sets and interact with event streams in a no-code experience where you can transform and route your event stream. So your real-time data can be interacted with through that experience. The Power BI experience should be probably the most familiar experience to everyone. It's where you interact with Power BI, create your reports, your dashboards. Not much has changed visually there, so that should be very familiar. We still have our workspaces, and we'll see that in the demo as well. The last experience here is the newcomer, Data Activator. This is a kind of a cool tool that I hadn't seen before, where we can monitor our data sets. We can monitor our measures, our KPIs, and drive actions if they exceed a threshold, for instance. So if you say, there's this many tickets in our ticketing system, drive some action. So it's kind of like bringing Azure functions under this umbrella, and I think it's going to be really powerful in the future. And remember, all of these experiences and the tools beneath them, their data and artifacts are built on top of OneLake. All right, so let's talk about the Power BI integration. Fabric can generally be thought of as taking Power BI and adding a SaaS version of Synapse to it. So it's kind of approaching data from the end state or the reporting end of the architecture rather than from the source. Power BI is used extensively in the industry. So much of the Fabric environment will be familiar to those with Power BI experiences. Like I mentioned, the Workspace paradigm still exists here and exists throughout Fabric. The skill set probably exists within your company for Power BI. Data analysts, I think, are much more prevalent than the data engineering skill set. So I think that's a benefit of Fabric, is your data analysts might now become kind of reluctant data engineers. In the past, we've heard of the reluctant DBA. So I think Fabric also has a chance to, or has the capability to kind of redefine roles within a data team. And part of that's because of the simplicity of Fabric. You can really get up and running in minutes rather than kind of days or weeks. There's no provisioning from the Azure portal. There's many fewer knobs in the wizards to deploy each of these services. So if you have Power BI, you now have access to Fabric, and you can quickly get access also to a free trial. There's a 60-day free trial. And from my experience, Fabric will be used for small departmental projects as well as like the largest enterprise projects. So it scales really well. You don't have to say, if we're doing a small data project, this is the architecture we should use. If we're doing a large data project, everything fits well and scales within Fabric. I did want to touch briefly on the performance improvement within Power BI and Fabric. Like I said, the UI, the interface is going to look very familiar, but under the hood, we have a new performance improvement called Direct Lake. And in the past, to get data into Power BI, there was two options: import, which could be scheduled. So, on some schedule, pull data from the data source into Power BI. Also, direct query was the second option, which would query live data. But there are some downsides. There's trade-offs to each one of those options. Now with Fabric, we have what's called direct lake. And you can think of that as import on demand. And this leverages that open format, that one open columnar Parquet Delta storage format that's been standardized within Fabric, which I'll talk to a little bit more once we talk about OneLake. It's using that, and it jives really well with the tabular model that Power BI uses to store data. So that's how we've come to this new paradigm, direct lake. And so we don't need to worry about scheduled imports anymore. We don't need to choose between the pros and cons of direct query and import. So I think that's a big benefit in Fabric when it comes to Power BI. All right, well, before we get into OneLake, let's briefly talk about capacities. Fabric is purchased using capacities. A capacity means a universal shared bucket of compute that is tenant specific. So if you're familiar with Power BI Premium SKUs, it's similar. They have the concept of capacity as well that you're paying for. In this slide, you can see two examples of how large companies might plan out their capacities for Fabric. On the left, we have retail company A. They have one tenant, and they have three capacities within that tenant: one for marketing, one for sales, one for finance. And then workspaces map to one capacity. So we've got three workspaces sharing the marketing capacity, two workspaces sharing the sales capacity, and three here sharing the finance capacity. Retail company B has two tenants. So you can see they have capacities in each tenant, and again, have those workspaces mapping to capacities. Everything is pay as you go right now for these capacities, but reserved capacity is coming. I just don't think that announcement has come out what the pricing will be, but that'll be a way to save some money on Fabric, as you can say, we know we're going to be using Fabric for the year. You can buy your capacity using reserved capacity and get some sort of a discount. There's also two ways to purchase your capacity. You can do so just how you're using the Power BI SKUs right now, the P SKUs. So you can buy those through your MS365 subscription, and those are billed monthly or yearly. The other way to purchase capacity for Fabric is called the Azure F SKUs, and that's through the Azure portal. So you provision capacity through the portal, and there's some slight differences. The F SKUs are billed by the second and allow you to pause and resume those capacities. So if you think you need that granular ability, maybe the F SKUs are right for you. And we can help, in a consulting capacity, in designing your capacities. There's also a capacity metrics page within Fabric to let you monitor usage. And Microsoft is working on a guide that I don't think has been released quite yet, that's going to help you choose the correct capacity right out the door. But right now, again, it's free. The free trial gives you a capacity, so you don't need to worry about choosing the capacity to get hands-on with the tool. In my opinion, this capacity model is a better model. Previously, within Synapse, you kind of had to decide on your architecture, understand the pricing for each piece, each engine within the tool, and fine-tune each engine, monitor each engine. But I like this bucket of compute that's shared between all the resources, that have been assigned to the capacity. It's also, everything's available from the get-go. There's no need to kind of add a data factory or add a event streams resource separately. It's very easy, and you'll see that in the demo of how to deploy these services. All right, so I've been promising we're going to talk about OneLake. Here it is. OneLake is the foundation for Fabric, and it's billed as the OneDrive for your data. What the OneLake is automatically provisioned for you, so just by merit of starting out with Fabric, you have a OneLake. And one of the big benefits of OneLake is that it can eliminate multiple copies of data getting stale. I think most of us are familiar with the benefits of having our Office files in OneDrive, where we can share the actual file and collaborate rather than email a copy of the file to somebody and save copies on individual PCs. So that concept kind of aligns here and makes it so we don't have to have separate copies of data. Another big thing that I mentioned with OneDrive that I really like is that we've standardized on one format, and that is the Delta format. Now that's not to say you can't store any file formats in your OneLake. You can. All file formats can be stored on the OneLake, but Delta is the default format, and it provides internal and, by its open source nature and wide industry adoption, external interoperability. Delta is very versatile, supports ACID transactions. It's built on top of the popular Parquet format, which has been used for years in big data, but it expands on that. Like I said, it gives you those ACID transactions, gives you something called time travel, which is really cool, where you can take a table and look at, what did this data look like, 3 weeks ago? It's unified streaming and batch, so you can use the same table. You could stream data into it or run batch transactions against it. So if you're not familiar with Delta, I definitely recommend check it out. The website for Delta is delta.io. So I think it's a big benefit. I'm really glad Microsoft has standardized on this format. Another big feature within OneLake is something called shortcuts. You can kind of see that here in the bottom right. We have Amazon S3 buckets, and shortcuts within OneLake are objects in OneLake that act as pointers to data in other locations. So if you have this data in an S3 bucket, without actually doing a copy pipeline to load that into your OneLake, you can just create a shortcut. So it's just a pointer to that S3 bucket. And then within Fabric, it looks like the data, it looks like any other data. It looks like data that you've loaded actually into the OneLake. It looks like it's just there and you can interact with it. So also shortcuts, I want to mention obey, the permissioning and user authorization rules. So if you don't have access to the external data source, you won't be able to see it. But if you do, it'll act just like data that's actually in the OneLake. So with OneLake, you get one security model. I think that's a big plus. One governance model, and it really makes it easy to find, share, and leverage all of your company's data. I want to mention also, we talked about capacity. People might ask, well, how much storage do we get in OneLake? We're still waiting to hear what the exact amount of data will be that you get included with a capacity. So I think that's yet to be announced, but there will be some data just included by default when you buy a capacity. But beyond that, pricing will be very similar to Azure Data Lake Storage V2. So it'll be, it's not like going to be capped, but you will have to pay a bit extra beyond the capacity for your storage. But ADLS V2 is very affordable. Another thing that I really like in OneLake that I wish was around when I started doing database or doing data warehouse migrations is the Explorer integration. So this is Windows Explorer. I'm sure everyone's familiar with Windows Explorer. We're used to having our OneDrives in there. So you can see I have my personal OneDrive up at the top, my work OneDrive up at the top, but down here at the bottom, we have OneLake right into our Windows Explorer. So we can see our workspaces, we can see our tables, and again, tables are going to be stored in that Parquet format. So we could drag and drop data right from our Windows Explorer into Fabric, start working on it immediately. So that would save me tons of time in a lot of the old migrations I did, nearly a decade ago. It's great for getting new data, sample data, getting it in, analyzing it. So Just wanted to mention that. All right, well, that's it for the for the slides. So let's get into the kind of the demo and tutorial. I meant to send this out early. I'm going to put it in chat. I hope everyone can see that. Yeah. So we're going to be going through a tutorial that Microsoft has put out. It's called Data Warehouse Tutorial Introduction. Feel free to follow along. I'm going to move relatively fast because we only have 20 minutes left. But if you want to follow along or follow along later with the recording, feel free to do so. Let's see. I'm going to be using a remote desktop. This is a VM in Azure. Let me just exit out of here. Just put on my do not disturb here. There we go. Okay, so this is what Fabric looks like from the website. So it's just fabric.microsoft.com. We'll bring you here. We can see, let's click here into the Power BI experience. So this will look familiar to people familiar with Power BI. We have our workspaces, so we can click into our workspaces. Let's create a new workspace here for this tutorial. We're going to call it, let's see what we call it in this workspace. I think it's Data Warehouse Tutorial. That makes sense. And when you're creating a workspace, you can assign it to a capacity. Like I said, that's how you decide what bucket of compute you're going to use. So if you had purchased capacity, you can see that down in the premium capacity. In this drop down, if you had multiple capacities, you could choose it here. We're going to do just the trial capacity because I think that's what most people watching the webinar will be doing. So here's the workspace. Nothing exists in the workspace yet. So the first thing we're going to do is create a warehouse. So why don't we go to the warehouse experience down here. This is where we get to our experiences. And it gives us the option to create a new warehouse. So let's do that. And look at how simple it is to create a warehouse. We're going to create a warehouse called, that's not what we're going to call it. I think we're going to call it Wide World Importers in alignment with the tutorial. And so, like I was saying, it's so simple to create a warehouse. That's it. Just give it the name. Much more simple than it was in the Azure portal interface. So this will create the warehouse. I want to mention this little kind of notification that pops up. It says that a default data set will be created. And this is the case for any warehouse that we create. A data set is automatically created. So this makes it really easy to do data modeling and start reporting off of our data. We don't have to do multiple sets of modeling. We don't have to open up Power BI and create a separate data model. It's created by default. All right, so this data warehouse is provisioning. All right, so we've built the warehouse. I'm going to turn off that notification. There's nothing in it, but we can see the warehouse here. We see a schema and security folder. First thing we're going to do is ingest some data. So let's create a new data pipeline. And we'll call this, what do we call this? Load customer data. We're going to load this from a public blob storage account. So it's building our pipeline here. And I'm just going to close this wizard just to show you the interface here. So here's our pipeline. We can choose, it gives us some easy buttons here. First thing we're going to do is add a pipeline activity, copy data. So this looks familiar to people that have used Azure Data Factory in the past. We've got our copy data activity here. We can call this load im customer. You need to specify a source. It's going to be an external blob storage account, like I mentioned. I've done this in the past, so I've got them here, but I'll show you kind of how we would import that. You say new. Look at all these connectors too. This is a big features, but probably you're familiar with this if you've used Data Factory. All these connectors are available to us to bring data in. In this case, it's a blob storage account. And we're going to be using in the tutorial, they've given us the URL, so I'm going to paste that in. It's kind of identifying that I've already created the connection, but we're going to create a new connection. We can give it a name, defaults to the connection string, but we'll call this wide world importers public sample. We'll use anonymous because this is a public data set. We don't need any authentication to it. Okay, so now we see that here. We have the connection. Now we need to specify the path, so the container. And I'm pulling all this from the tutorial here. Get the directory. And in this case, we're going to be pulling from a Parquet file. And normally we wouldn't pull data that's already in a dimensional model, but in the interest of time, we're just going to pull it already kind of transformed into a dimensional model. We have to specify the file format here as Parquet. And that should be about it for the source. Now for the destination, we're going to be loading that into our data warehouse, which we just created. And our data warehouse, wide world importers. And we don't have any tables in there, so let's auto create the destination table. We'll call it DBO dimension customer. All right, and that's all we have to do. So we can just hit run here. We'll save the pipeline with our copy data activity, and it will run it. And we can see our runs here. We're getting notifications that the run has started. We can monitor in this output tab the status of the run. You can see it's in progress. I like these little glasses here to see the details of my run, so I'll click on that. Come on. It'll bring up the details of this pipeline run. Shows that we're pulling from blob storage into our data warehouse. It's in progress. It's been running for 25 seconds. And we can dig in and see the different kind of stages of the process. And we can see that that succeeded. So that's one way to pull data into the data warehouse. They're very simple. Let's look at other ways to load data into the data warehouse. So we can leave our pipeline, head back into our data warehouse. And this is the icon for data warehouse. This is the worldwide importers data warehouse. And now we're going to do some interaction with our warehouse via SQL. So let's do and you can see it brought us right into our table that we just created, which is kind of nice. It shows us a sample of that data we just loaded. Well, let's interact with our warehouse using SQL. Again, the warehouse is where we do most of our SQL or traditional SQL interaction with our data. So I'm copying in from the tutorial kind of some drop and create table statements. So we're going to get a dim city here, and we're going to get our fact table. So drop and create those tables. Let's run that. Let's save this query by renaming it. Let's call it create tables. Oops, it jumped away. After it runs the queries, it tends to jump back to the data tab to show you the data that was just created or the tables that were just created. But we can rename that script as create tables. And we can see our queries saved in the My Queries folder down here. We could also drag those into the shared queries folder if we want to share those with colleagues. All right, so we've created those tables. We can see them here under our tables folder. So now let's load some data into those tables via SQL this time. So a new SQL query. And these queries will be familiar to you if you've dealt with the data warehouse under Synapse. So we're going to be using the copy into syntax. So copy into the table, the source, in this case, blob storage source, Parquet files. And that's all we need to do. So let's run those. These will take a little bit, so I'm not going to wait for them. I'm going to just rename this query to load tables. And we'll move on to the next step. We'll come back. This should take no more than 2 minutes or so to load. It's a little bit more data since we're loading that fact table. But in the meantime, we can keep working, start a new query. And in this query, we're going to create a stored procedure for transforming that data. In this case, this stored procedure is going to populate an aggregate table, so sales by city. So let's run this stored procedure. Stored procedure doesn't require that the data is loaded, even though it might be by now. I'll check back here in a second. Let's jump back into the data section there, which happens a lot, but we can come back here and we can name this create Sprock. That's not what this tutorial tells us to call it, but that's good enough for me. And that stored procedure has been created. We can see it here under our stored procedures folder. All right, this load tables is still running. I think it's going to finish very soon. In the meantime, oh, there it is, it finished. So we can see it loaded 100,000 records into one table and 50 million records into that fact table. So pretty good in a minute and a half. And now let's create a query to execute that stored procedure. I'm just going to call this exec sprock, and we'll run this. And you can run it. I just ran that with Control Enter. I like keyboard shortcuts, so that's another way to run these queries. All right. So that ran, brings us over to the data. We can see the aggregate data loaded here into this new table. So that stored procedure created this table and loaded it. So multiple ways to load data into a data warehouse as you'd expect. So we've just been playing around with SQL queries. I want to show you something that didn't exist in Synapse. This is called new visual query. So a visual query editor. So if you're not familiar with SQL, but you kind of understand the table design, you kind of understand what you want to get, maybe this is the experience within the data warehouse experience that you'd like to use to join and transform your data. So within this visual query editor, we can drag in tables from the left. So we know we're going to pull some data from the sales table. And in this case, we're also going to pull some data in from the cities table. Oops. Sometimes we get errors. Again, we're in a preview mode. I'm not familiar with this error. I think we'll be fine. Let's see. Let's see if we can get this dim city in here. There we go. Not sure exactly what happened there. All right, but let's. This fact table is very big, as we saw. So let's just do a top 10,000 from this table. So we can reduce the number of rows. So keep top 10,000 rows from the fact table, pulling everything in from the city table. So now let's do a transformation. Let's combine. Let's merge these two tables. So in the left-hand table, we'll choose the dim city. On the right, we'll choose the fact table. And we're going to join these on city key. So we just select those two. And it says, let's see, it does some validation to make sure that they can join. It says, yep, we've got some matches. In this case, we're going to do an inner join and hit OK. So now we're joining our fact table to our city table, and we've got our result here. So in the result set here, we can see our data from the city dimension. And on the right here, we see our fact table. Let's select what columns we want to bring in from our fact table. So what measures are we interested in getting using this visual query editor? Let's say tax amount, profit, and total including tax. All right, so now we have our table. Now let's do an aggregation. Let's transform and group by. Let's group by country. So we're looking at our metrics here from our fact table, and we're grouping by country, state, province, and city. This is, this is a real world example. This is something we might want to get out of our fact and dimension tables. So we're going to get sum of tax amount, sum of profit, and we're going to get sum of total including tax. And we're not going to be doing a count, we're doing a sum. So let's change these to the sum operation. And tax amount's correct there. This one needs to be profit. And this one needs to be total including tax. All right. So this is another way to get an aggregate. So we saw, we can create an aggregate using a stored procedure, but we could also get an aggregate using this visual query editor, which ultimately is kind of using the Power Query editor, which you might be familiar with. So let's save this. It's down here under our queries, just like our SQL queries. So we can save it just by renaming it to sales summary. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about a lakehouse. We've talked about the data warehouse, but we want to create a lakehouse as well. And I mentioned in the beginning that lakehouses are more of your Spark and Notebook environment. And you see, just as easy as it was to create a data warehouse, we can create a lakehouse. So let's call this shortcut exercise, because we're going to show the shortcut feature of the OneLake that I mentioned at the same time as showing the lakehouse. So here's our lakehouse, quickly deployed, and we got some options to get data into our lakehouse. We're going to use a shortcut, and we're going to create that pointer from data that already exists in our OneLake. And we're going to pull it from the warehouse that we just created. Let me make sure, because I have a backup version, in case something went wrong on this demo. But we got the one that we were just working with. And we're going to pull in data via a shortcut. And I think we're going to pull in, dim customer in this case. So we loaded data via shortcut into our lakehouse here, and we'll see that show up here on the left. There it is. We can click on it. We can preview the data here. And now we can interact with this data in the Notebook environment, in the Spark environment, if that's what we prefer. So let's open a notebook, new notebook. And so this is a Spark notebook. It defaults to PySpark, which I prefer, but you can also go to Scala, R, or Spark SQL. And they make it really easy to load data. So, syntax can be more difficult than straight SQL, I think. But if you just drag the table over, it'll initialize a data frame. So df equals spark.sql, and it's selecting everything from that table, limiting the results to 1,000. And then we're going to display the results of that, or display what's in that data frame. So that's what's happening here. So now we're interacting with that same data. We didn't create a copy of dim customer. The data lives exactly where it lived after our load, but now we're interacting with it in this Spark environment. I like this notebook environment. It gives you the flexibility, of PySpark to do very advanced transformations. So you can see your results here. I also like the charting capability of a notebook, so you can quickly create nice little charts within the notebook. You can add Markdown to define your notebooks. We're not going to spend much more time here in the notebook environment, but just wanted to mention that it's here. Very intuitive for those who are familiar with Spark, with Databricks, to interact with our data. All right, well, let's get back to our data warehouse. And now we're going to show a capability within Fabric, which is called cross-warehouse querying. So we created one warehouse called Wide World Importers. Let's create a second warehouse. All right, so we're going to create a warehouse, and we're going to use, for the source of that warehouse, the SQL endpoint that was automatically provisioned when we created our lakehouse. So we check this, hit confirm, and now we have that lakehouse back into our warehouse. So here it is, and the only data that's there is that one table that we created via a shortcut. So it's dim customer. So it's kind of silly. We're kind of going back and forth on this example, but it's just showing the capability. And here we're going to show another capability, which doesn't really make sense in the real world, but it's showing that we can query across data warehouses. So in this query, we're pulling from fact sales in worldwide importers. And we're using that 3-part name to query dim customer out of the shortcut warehouse that we just created. So the one over here. And we can run that. And we can call this cross database query, cross warehouse. So a nice feature if you have a lot of warehouses to know that you can query across them. And it'll show the results down here. All right, now let's get into some more visually stimulating results here, and that's going to be Power BI reports. Like I mentioned, we have this model tab, this data set that's created by default when we create a data warehouse. So it automatically knows that we have all these tables, and it brings them into this data set for modeling. So let's just tell it how these tables connect. Let's give it some information about the relationships. So for instance, we know city key maps to city key over here. So we can just drag and drop and make that connection. And we say from fact sales to dimension is a many to one, and it's going to be an active relationship, and it's going to be, we're going to assume referential integrity, which will make it a little bit more performant and won't have to kind of question whether it does map. And we can do the same thing to dim customer. It doesn't do the customer mapping in the tutorial, but I prefer to map it. So again, this is going to be a many to one, and it's going to be referential integrity. All right, so now that we've kind of created our data model, you can move this stuff around. Most people like their fact table in the middle. We've got our aggregate table over here. We're not kind of tying that into this schema here. But now let's go ahead and create a report off of this data set. So we can do so easily by just hitting new report. And we're brought into the UX experience, brings out a new tab for the report, brings up this Power BI interface. So let's start by creating a report. We're going to use dim city. We're going to use sales territory, and the data, the measures for this territory are going to be the profit. Oops, I think we want a column chart for this one. Yeah, that's what the tutorial does. And just like that, we see our profit per sales territory. So very easy to go from your data right to a report. And I think that's the simplicity that Fabric provides us. And look how quick we're getting results here. Let's add another type of visualization here. In this case, a mapping visualization. So let's bring state province here into the location for our map. And we'll look at profit as well as our data, as our size here. You can see this bubble chart of profit. And quickly here, we're just building out Power BI report. We'll add one more element to our report here. In this case, a table visual. In this case, we'll use Gem City again. We'll do sales territory, sales province. And we'll bring in the profit from our fact table. Oops, missed clicking that one. Oops, let me see what I did wrong here. Oops, we don't want that here. Oh, we want it lower. Okay, so there we can see this kind of report, and we can save this report. It's an interactive report, what I like, so you can kind of click on New England, and it'll filter the rest of the visuals. So here we can see kind of a summary of New England. We can click into New England and then say Vermont, and just see what the sales are from Vermont. You can see kind of a portion of New England it is. So nice interactive reports available to us within Power BI. Quick to come here, quick to create. Let's save this one. Let's call this sales analysis. And that report is saved. All right, one last quick report, and then we'll get into questions. This is the OneLake Data Hub, where you can see all the data and elements within Fabric that you have access to. So let's get in here into our worldwide importers default data set. And what we can do from here, we created a report manually, but this is a really cool feature. It's called auto create report. So let's click on that. And it will try to intuit what you might want to see in a report based on your data model. And sometimes it's good at doing that. Sometimes it needs a little help. You can see here, it says, you can pre-select the data you're most interested in. Otherwise, it's going to kind of just guess. So it didn't do a great job of guessing here, but still we can click around what we might be interested in. So we just did one kind of by city. Let's do one kind of by customer. Let's say we're interested in our profits based on our customer buying group. So I checked buying group in the customer, and we're not interested in stock item key. We're more interested in profit. So let's check those two. And then it's auto-generating visuals related to those dimensions and metrics that you've chosen on the right here. So I think that's really nice. It creates a quick starting point. It also can create a bit of a narrative associated with your graph. So I just think that's a really nice feature that I hadn't used before Fabric. So wanted to bring that to your attention. And I think that's it for the demo, for the hands-on. Again, I put the link to that tutorial so you can jump through it yourself. I put that in the chat. So let's jump back over to the presentation, and I'll start reading any questions you guys have put into chat. And I did want to mention, it can be confusing. I showed both the data warehouse and the lakehouse, which one is right for you. And I think what I tried to show is that they're interoperable, so you don't get kind of locked into one versus the other. But ultimately, it kind of comes down to how you're going to be writing data out using those tools. If you're going to be writing data out using SQL, you want to use the warehouse experience. If you're going to be writing data out using Spark, PySpark, Scala, you're going to want to use that Lakehouse experience. There's some more differences between the two. For instance, if you're doing kind of trickle inserts into your data, it's better to use the warehouse for operations like that. Also, if you require multi-table transactional support, that's only available within the warehouse, not available in the Lakehouse. So there's some pros and cons of each one of those, but what's really nice about Fabric is they're both available to you. First question, will there be the ability to replay on YouTube? Yes, there will. I think that'll be sent out to everybody that was here or signed up even. So even if you didn't make the whole call, I think you'll get that in your email. So also just wanted to mention, if you are interested in working with us, we're talking already with a number of companies about Fabric engagements. Feel free to reach out to myself. My email's here. I can put you in touch with some of our client executives, and we can go from there. I've got my Twitter handle on here too. So thanks for attending. I don't see any more questions coming through. We've got 2 minutes left in the hour, so glad I made it through. I know I went pretty fast, so definitely check out that recording if you need help going through that tutorial. There's a couple other tutorials that I think are valuable that Microsoft has put out, and you can link to those from the tutorial that I linked in chat. So check that out to get more hands-on. All right. Well, I think that's it. So thank you everybody again for joining, and we'll see you in the next webinar.